And that's where I go back. I'm like, okay, if you're making a hardware decision and you're gonna put another moving part on the planner, it working and being logistically efficient has to be a part of the equation, because in all reality, you're going to get 3 days where you're like, this is the best it's planted all season. And you want to get as many acres as you can in that little window, and it's typically really small, even relative to the small window of the total planting.
Sure.
But you normally get 2 or 3 days that you feel really, really good about it.
So welcome back to another episode of the Agriculture Podcast, and today we're joined by our first official guest. His name is Jesse Little. He's a great friend of mine, known each other now probably, I don't know, getting close to 20 years maybe?
Yeah.
Okay, so he's our local pioneer agronomist, and we worked together first for the competition and for Monsanto when he was a dealer rep, or
I was a local rep over the retail business for Monsanto in the purchase area, Kentucky.
So he migrated from there and he switched allegiances, and now he owns a Pioneer dealership. And we just became great friends, and I've followed him throughout his career, and now I'm sitting here doing a podcast with him. So.
Well, I'm honored to be the first guest. I didn't know I was, so thank you.
Yeah. So we've been on a couple of adventures together too.
Mm-hmm.
Got to do a Dall sheep hunt. Both were successful.
Yeah.
Super cool.
It's funny. I asked Neil when we were on the float plane coming back. I was terribly missing my. I'm not saying you didn't miss your family, but I was like, okay, I've been in a tent for 7 days. I've been on a horseback, for a couple of days. I'm sore. I'm wet. I'm tired. I'm ready to go home. And I'll never forget looking at you in that little float plane. And it's pretty tight in those things. Anyway, I'm like, you ready to go home? He said, I could stay here another month. I'm like, oh my God, give me a bath and a shower and a hot meal. That was a lot of fun.
It was. I love the outdoors, and that's one of the most beautiful areas you'll see.
Yeah. Well, and I think the beauty of trips like that has been, it's usually so busy in our business when you're planning, and if we're walking fields, we're trying to game plan and figure out a strategy and all those other things. And a trip like that allows you to kind of me understand you better and you understand me better. So that was a lot of fun. That's what I appreciated about it.
Yeah, it was, and just getting to it'll teach you something about yourself in those kind of environments.
Yeah,
you learn where your weaknesses are.
Yeah,
rapidly.
It
your strengths.
taught me that I don't know. It's funny you watch. So have you seen the new 1830s? What's the deal with Yellowstone? The new, is it 1886?
Okay,
it's 1886, and being out there for 10 or 12 days like we were, I tell you what it did. I mean, I watched that. I'm like, the grit that those people had because that's kind of how we lived out there for 10 days, horseback camping, no cell phone, no nothing. And I can't imagine being those people that pioneered across the West back in the day. It's
unbelievable. Like being able to cut a living totally off the land because you had no supplies other than what you could pack.
Yeah. We got it for 10 days.
Yeah. Think about it for years.
I know.
So what are we going to talk about today?
I think everybody's kind of got a story, and I'm a seed guy by nature, so I love talking about hybrids and varieties and traits and direction we're going to go from a seed placement perspective. But everybody's got a bit of a story outside of maybe what they particularly do every day. And I make a living selling seed for the most part, but the planter fertility side of my business, if you will, from making recommendations and doing agronomy work, there's kind of a story there for me that I think maybe somebody could glean something from. And so I would say mostly I'd probably like to spend some time talking about planter fertility and kind of the process. So I'm sure everybody's in a different place in their journey with that. Some haven't even started. Some may never do it. And then some are doing everything imaginable underneath the sun on, running on a planter from a fertility perspective. But I could probably help maybe talk about my process in that, even though I don't particular farm, for a living. But I do a lot of work on plantar fertility. So, I mean, I think that's probably, I could share my story with that.
Yeah. So to give you a little background about Jesse, a little more background. Um, Not only do you do sales in West Kentucky and West Tennessee, you also do a lot of test plots with your own planter.
That's right.
And he's also a cattle producer. So he's been on the representative side of ag. He's been in the sales side of ag, and he's also been as a producer in ag. So he's got a very unique perspective that most people don't have. Most people are in one of the three, but not all three.
Yeah.
So he brings a unique perspective. And now, how many years have you been doing plantar fertility trials?
This will be my sixth, going into 24 will be my sixth spring with my research planner.
Okay, so 6 seasons in research, and he does replicated plots, and they're very fair. He actually has done some on this farm.
2 years.
For 2 years.
Yep.
So that just gives you a little background of what you're getting when you're hearing him talk. So he's got a lot of knowledge, and we appreciate his perspective on it.
So I guess if I started from the beginning, you made mention of that. Worked for Bayer, Monsanto at the time, for nearly 10 years. Wanted to be self-employed. A corporate job out of college is really fun because you get a truck, you get a credit card, you get to go on trips, you get to do all the fun stuff. But then you get 3 kids at home and you get settled down, and being home is more important than going to meetings and stuff. Sure. And so that's really what drove the Pioneer dealership. They gave me an opportunity, right, to kind of own my own business and be an entrepreneur and still be selling seed. But when I made that transition, that was about 6 years ago is kind of when that really next level was taken off with Randy and David and some others. And there was a lot, there's a tremendous amount of interest in plantar fertility. Okay. I'm not saying 20 years ago guys weren't putting a little starter fertilizer on with their planter, but at least in West Kentucky, if you think about 10 years ago, how many planters had plantar fertility on in West Kentucky?
Almost zero.
I don't know of one. And I'm sure there was somebody that we don't know about that was already doing. I've been doing that for 20 years. But in all reality, I was in the industry, and I thought I was pretty in tune with what people were doing. And there just wasn't a lot of planter setups putting on liquid fertilizer at planting in our area to speak of until about 6 or 7 years ago. And so I looked at it as an opportunity as be the objective source for my growers. I'm selling them the seed. I'm not necessarily selling the fertility at that point in time, but it's hard for you to implement a trial on your farm with plantar fertility. I mean, you don't have a planter that's set up, right? And so a lot of times you're making that decision to set it up without having personal experience with it. So it was just a way for me to provide a personal experience to my growers on their farms under their management practices with plantar fertility before they made a big, large investment on their own farm. So that's kind of how all that got started. And there's, I'll give credit where credit's due. I mean, there's other people like Beck's PFR and some other stuff that, some other avenues where they were kind of doing some of those same trials. My only gripe, I guess you would say, with some of those is typically those are done in centralized locations, right? So they pick one farm, their research farm. Let's say it's a research farm in Champaign, Illinois. I'm just making something up. I'm not saying they're not doing really good work there, but I challenge because it's different everywhere you go. And so I wanted to see those type of trials done, but in a mobile way. And the only way I knew to do that was to build my own little 6-row research planter and go from farm to farm and replicate those trials and then try to come to conclusion for my growers what direction made sense from a plantar fertility perspective. So that's kind of how all that got started, just to give you kind of a look back.
Yeah, and it has been interesting to look back at the data and see what you've found, what has worked and what hasn't worked. And, and this is the thing about plantar fertility. I have never got a good handle on what I'm doing with it, or I have seen gains in it, but I can't always tell you it's going to pencil out to a ROI. So
It's so interesting. Um, when you're doing trial work, you have this weird expectation that live in this box that is controlled every year, and the outcome's going to be the same all the time. And I think if I've learned anything, it's that nothing works 100% of the time, and something's always changing from year to year. So it typically can be very difficult to put your finger on what you think works at least the majority of the time, right? Because if you can get something, if you can change an input or change a practice on your farm and it works 75% of the time, that's a win.
Sure.
That's a big win, because it's not the same, the hybrid, the treatment, the product, it's not going to be 100% all the time.
Our environmental conditions change so much each year. Our temperature, how many days of sunshine, how many days of rainfall, and all those things influence, how good the crop can be.
That's
and
right.
then sometimes you make a move that would be positive for one season, but then the environmental conditions change, and then the next season that change may be a negative.
Yeah.
So it is very difficult to get a handle on what you can be successful in and what you cannot.
Agree.
So what have you learned over the course of 6 years?
The biggest thing I've probably learned maybe isn't necessarily about a particular product. It's kind of being in the middle seems like is usually the best place to be. And we've had this conversation before. We don't necessarily want to farm like we farmed 30 years ago. But we don't want to be overly ambitious and think that every little thing we look at is going to work. And we want to add every piece of hardware to the planter that's an option in a farm journal magazine or something like that. And you don't want to put on every single product that you see come by. I think I've learned, and we'll talk about products and kind of nutrients that I think have settled out to be the winners. But the other reason I think having my own planter and being mobile is I needed to understand y'all more, because a lot of people that make recommendations that work in the industry, they don't understand what it's like to come to the shop in the morning and have to mix all that stuff up. There's less appreciation there sometimes when you're not the one doing it. We've made the recommendations because we think that's the right thing to do, but in all reality, you logistically have to get it done. And I've noticed in our industry, there's a bit of a disconnect between making recommendations, but also being very respectful to understanding that you have a set amount of hours in a day that you have to allocate to get things done. And so by having my own planner, I have an appreciation for if something plugs up, it's no good, right?
Right.
If it takes me too long to make a mix that I think makes sense, and even though I picked up a half a bushel, it was not worth the logistical trouble of that. That has probably allowed me to have more appreciation when you make a recommendation, understand that you have to implement it, right?
That's right. So if you haven't been in on planter fertility on your farm yet, so you already have your seed logistics that you have to get to the planter. Mm-hmm. It just adds an extra element, because you have to have a water truck or trailer, and if you have lots of things in the mix other than nitrogen, you have to have individual shuttles or containers, because a lot of times these things need to be mixed as you put them on board the planter in certain orders. So it just adds an additional logistical element to the process.
It's like appreciating an employee's job. You never appreciate it until you did it. So it's kind of that work from the ground up. So then when you're making those calls, that you appreciate what that other person's having to go through to get that done.
That's right. At the end of the day, not only does it really needs to make a big enough yield gain or revenue gain to pay for the additional labor to do the process as well.
Yeah, we typically factor in when we look at a product on the planter that we're going to apply, whether that be a nitrogen product or a phosphorus product. We typically look at that as what is the cost of that product and how many bushels did I get back. But a lot of times we don't factor in the hardware,
right,
and the time.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably been my evolution is trying to put a value to that, to still say, okay, it covered the product, but in my opinion, it's also covering some of the expenses from a logistical perspective that's slowing you down, probably,
sure.
Right?
Hey guys, Clayton here. I'm interrupting your podcast right now to tell you about my media company, Atlas Media Solutions, that makes this podcast possible, as well as all the Denton Farms media happen. So I'm going to play a quick ad real quick that I put together. It doesn't really explain that much, but it does sound pretty cool. So I'm going to let you guys listen to that, and afterwards I'll explain to you what the business is all about. Spend enough time on the internet these days, you start to realize there's a lot of people who don't really understand where their food comes from, what's going on. I figured, hey, rather than complaining about this problem that I feel like the agriculture industry is facing, I should do something to fix it. My name is Clayton Lind. The purpose of this business is to do one thing: serve agriculture. Thanks for listening to that, guys. I won't spend too much time explaining what Atlas Media Solutions is, but Atlas Media Solutions is my media marketing company that 100% exists just to serve agriculture. A lot of my time is spent on the road or on a plane, traveling around the country, producing high quality media material for different ag businesses. And so if you guys want to learn more, please feel free to check out our website or follow me on Instagram. But we just wanted to kind of plug this to let you know that because of this business that I run, it allows all of this stuff with Neil and the YouTube channel to happen in the first place. And so as long as we are sponsor free, I will continue to tell you that this podcast is brought to you by Atlas Media Solutions, and we are proud to say that we are here 100% to serve agriculture. So that's spiel, guys. I'll let you get back to the podcast. Enjoy. Thanks.
So that's what a little bit of what I've learned is, and in doing it, sometimes less is better. Like I got to the point where I had so much on the planner that it's overwhelming. You can't keep, if you've got an Infura system running, you got a 2x2 system running, plus you're trying to accurately plant seed, how many things do you want to fool with 3 systems on there all the time, and each one of them individually giving trouble? Sometimes it's, what we did was reduced to just 2x2, and because we've had some success with just applying nitrogen, and then we tinker with adding different elements to see what kind of surprise we get at the end.
Isn't it funny how most people's kind of process is all similar in the sense that when you say a guy is not doing any fertility on the planter and he goes into it and he's going to start doing fertility on the planter, it's almost like you've never owned a car and all of a sudden somebody says, hey, go pick out whatever you want, right? You go there and I want this option and I want this option and I want this and I want that. And then as time goes on, you realize, okay, I was a little overzealous there. I probably shouldn't have done all that stuff. And so I wanted to be the guy that kind of picked out the low-hanging fruit so you didn't get yourself in a bind getting too excited about everything, right? And I went through that with setting my research planner up, right? I mean, so I started with this bare John Deere 7000 frame, 6-row, and I essentially went to precision planning, and I was like, I want this, and I want that on it, and I want downforce, and I want conceal, and I want this. And I had a laundry list, and we set it up, and I was so proud of it. And I'm like, look at all that stuff, And come to find out, there's issues with some of those products. Sure. Things happen. Yeah. We had a I don't know if we should say anything negative about anything on here. Are we in a trust tree here or what? But
no, we're open to say anything.
I had a lot of trouble with conceal, and at that time you were talking $800 a row, and I'll never forget, we were planting a plot, and typically when we plant a plot, I usually have somebody there to help me in a side-by-side or Ranger or UTV of some sort, and he's like, man, your gauge wheels are scooting back there. And I said, I would have never known. I look over at the monitor, and I have 100% ground contact. Everything's green. It looks great. And I go, why don't you run the planter one pass, and I want to watch it. And I go back there, and every once in a while, you just see that gauge wheel like catch and scoot. So it was still holding the row unit against the ground, but it was scooting. And I realized the knives in between the conceal is that split gauge wheel, and they put a coulter, or a knife in between the gauge wheel. And conceptually, it's a fantastic idea. I love it, right? But when you have to make that thing go work, you realize that it may be, that may have been a little bit better to put my nitrogen on that way than maybe just dribbling on top of the ground. But it's costing me other things because the gauge wheel, mechanically, it was creating some problems that impacted my stand.
Yeah, it got, I had an experience with Conceal as well. And, one of the issues with Conceal is it wants to lift the row unit out of the ground. And I think that's probably where you were getting that skid at, is just you hit a hard spot and the planter doesn't have enough downforce available to force it into the ground.
Well, my experience was that knife in there got like cocked a little bit, where it was rubbing the inside of the gauge wheel, and it was enough friction. And I'd stop and I'd reset it and I'd get it lined up and I'd lift the gauge wheel up and it'd be right in the middle and we'd go to plant again. And then that thing would kind of get cocked in there again and it'd be enough friction. It would slow that gauge wheel down. But where I was going with that is I was the guy that wanted everything on the planter, right? And then now, because I was the one having to work on it, and I was the one that was seeing how much time it was costing to do certain things, you find yourself backing off from the most progressive things to figuring out how do we be progressive, chase after the next bushel, but do it in a respectful way to logistics and input costs and all those other things. So I think after the last 6 years, I was the guy that wanted everything the first year or two. Now I'm wiser, more mature when it comes to planter fertility, that I'm like, hey, here's the middle of the road. Here's the products. Here's the hardware on the planter that I think can make sense for you to not create too many pains, but chase after the next dollar, right? From a yield perspective.
Right. Clayton and I talk about this a lot on here is, how it's good to be just moderate, to not go just full regen ag, or not to go full old school moldboard plow. I mean, every little niche environmental region has all different soil types and conditions in it. No two practices work on the same place. And even in the same county, we have very diverse conditions. So what might work really well on the southern end of the county might not work as good on the northern end of the county.
You think about whether it's farming, or I don't even want to get political, but even think about it from a political perspective. The work's always done in the middle. It's never done on either extreme, right? And we say that about politics. The work's never done on each opposite side. The work's always done in the middle. And I've come to figure out that farming practices is a lot like that. You don't want to be. It's like the guy that wants to go down the we got a fella in West Kentucky, and I conceptually I love what he does. He's hardcore regen, right? So cover crop, no-till, planting green, roller crimping. Like, I'm all into that stuff because I love soil health. I want to leave things better than I find them. But now we've got vole issues really bad, and it's costing a lot of money because of having critters in those fields, because of the environment we've created. We're having trouble just getting stands of crops. And so back to never say never, right? Those guys would have said, I'm never, ever going to till again. But there comes a point in time to where going back to the middle a little bit isn't bad, right?
Yeah.
And that's typically where I find myself wanting to be, is I don't want to be the guy that's farming like it was 35 years ago, because things have changed, right? But I'm not going to jump on every little new thing that comes out in the market. And I'm going to test. And you need to do that for yourself too as a farmer.
I agree. What I've learned most in my maturation throughout, my career in ag is to be, just middle of the road. You want to be as good as you can be each and every day, but to push the boundaries every single year on every single thing will exhaust you, and it'll exhaust your resources as well. So, it's good sometimes to watch the early adapters struggle, and they will, and some of those guys that are early adapters are super good at it, and they can make early determinations and it pans out for them. Most people aren't precise enough to be able to effectively use that model on their farm. And I think for most of us, it's best to just watch the early adapters, learn, and you'll pick up some stuff from them, and then, begin to transition yourself into that new practice. Yep. See what has worked and what hasn't, and it'll save you a lot of heartache in the end, a lot of money as well.
And I guess that was kind of the business model. I was wanting to be that 2-year buffer for guys that were dealing with me on their seed corn and their beans and stuff. I wanted to be that early adopter in their eyes, to where we could filter through the stuff that works and doesn't work. But it's so funny. I go back and I look at my planter today versus my research planter when I first started, and it looks different. I'll give you an example. We don't have $800 a row conceal on there anymore. We have some total tubular stainless steel deals that come out by the closing wheels, and we dribble our fertility on top of the ground. It doesn't affect my row unit. It was really economical to put on there, because the reality of it is I'm paying for that stuff.
Sure.
Pioneer wasn't giving me an allotment to do this testing. It was Jesse Little or Little Seed Company that was going out there and having to set this planter up under my expense. So I valued, hey, I think I could get similar results with less headache and trouble by just dribbling my fertility out the back. And I'm not saying that's for everybody, but that just seemed like what made the most sense for us and me. And I haven't seen a big difference in it.
And you don't have the plugging issues
Yep.
that you're going to have out of a true 2x2 system, because, in reality, there's so many different field conditions that you're going to experience some type of field condition during the course of that season that is going to plug the 2x2.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're going to get some, and with something like Totally Tubular, it's just, and I'm not selling Totally Tubular.
Me
here.
neither.
You could run you some rubber tubes back there, I guess, and have you basically the same thing. But you eliminate the plugging issue. It's just simplicity.
Yeah. Well, it's the process of going, okay, let's say this piece of hardware, because of the way it puts on the liquid nitrogen, is a half a bushel better than just putting it on top of the ground. But that doesn't. That person's not figuring in that says, oh, well, it was a half a bushel better across all my trials, or a bushel better. Well, yeah, what happens when it plugs up and it costs you 3 hours of planting?
Yeah, and ultimately, like those openers, I'm running the original John Deere opener, like the old school that's been out since the 70s. I mean, that's lugging a lot of horsepower, so it's burning diesel too.
Yep.
So
that has been one of the probably least problematic ways, if a guy wants to put it in the ground, that I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, it's very simple. It's proven. Kenzie's got a similar system that they've had out, as old as Methuselah or whatever. And, it's effective. It works. It puts it down there, and it doesn't cause, it's not perfect, but it doesn't cause as many problems as some of the new, modern technology does.
So that's kind of been my journey on hardware. I mean, we haven't really even got into what products and what nutrients make the most sense, at least locally, and it may be different somewhere else, but I think hardware is something that's universal. Like, that conversation about finding a middle road of what is cost effective to, if I'm going to go down the road or go on my journey, hey, I'm going to set up a planter and I'm going to run some liquid fertilizer through my planter. It doesn't matter if you're in Iowa or Illinois or wherever. A lot of the options are the same no matter where you go. And I think that process has been really good and probably universal for everybody, in the sense that my experience is the $850 row per row piece of hardware that allowed me to put something 3/4 of an inch in the ground was not worth it for me in my eyes. Right. Now, when we get into nutrients, it may be different. I can speak to how it's done in the purchase area of Kentucky, but hardware is pretty universal.
I agree. I mean, what we're using in Kentucky is very similar to what they're using in Iowa or Ohio or Texas. We're all using the same hardware. Yeah, I agree. Fertility is going to be different, but the same as well. So,
have you seen yourself on hardware when you first started planter fertility, wanting every little bell and whistle?
Sure. That's what I started out as, like my very first or second season. I think the first season I put about half of every gadget you could put on there, and by the second season I had every gadget known to man on there. And it absolutely, it was the most stressful season of my life, and I about missed a crop working on the stuff, and it put me at my wit's end. So, I've gone from that point back to and I was young and dumb, that was 6 or 7 years ago too. I was in my late 30s. I kind of got bored, and to be honest with you, with what I'd been doing, and I kind of got on that next level kick, and and I'm not saying anything those guys do. They're excellent farmers and growers, and but I kind of got in that mindset and trying to push my yields to the next level, and it about broke me mentally just because I was trying to do too much, and I've kind of, that taught me a lot, and it taught me to moderate my thinking and my use of how much logistically I could, do and not lose my mind over it.
Yeah.
So from there, I've had a pretty good experience with it after I got past the point of just wanting everything and just realized, hey, this is what effective for me, and I try not, I'll do a little bit of something different each season as I learn, but I don't throw all my eggs in one basket on anything.
Yep. If a guy sat down today that has nothing on their planter and they said, Jesse, do I need to put some liquid fertilizer on my planter? I would say yes. From what I have done on trial work, if I was king for a day and somebody said, hey, you're managing my 2,500 acres, you treat it however you want to, I would have planter fertility. I would have liquid fertilizer on my planter. But from a hardware perspective, I've moderated what I would have done 6 years ago to today. And I would even say maybe from a product perspective, that's changed, but that's always evolving. The different products come out, you test them. It's going to be different 10 years from now. But I think we've figured out what the foundation from a fertility perspective needs to be. And we can talk about that next, I guess, if you want to. But I would have it on my planter, but I would not have every hardware option available that maybe makes sense in your mind until you have to go put it out there. Makes sense on paper. Okay, well, you're going to put your nitrogen and sulfur 3/4 of an inch deep if you do this. I'd be like, we get plenty of rain in April. I'm going to dribble it on top of the ground, and most likely we'll have a rain in 3 or 4 days, and it'll work that nitrogen and sulfur down into my root zone. So that's kind of been my story on the hardware piece of stuff.
No, and I would agree too. Like I've been able to be successful applying nitrogen, to the corn plant, and then I found some other things that I feel like work most of the time as well. So that's kind of my perspective too. Just moderate the approach, though. Don't try to get every bell and whistle on there, because at the end of the day, those things have to work for a long season, and you have to be able to have some time to be able to just run the planter and not drive yourself crazy working on stuff. Because at the end of the day, mentally, you're already challenged without, extra breakdowns on things that may or may not make you money at the end of the day.
Realistically, do you plant 12 hard days of spring? In the field planting, is it 12 or 14 days?
Probably. That's probably
somewhere in there.
Yeah. This is where what I've learned to do over the course of the last 10 years or so is I've learned that it's best not to put all my eggs in one basket. So I'll kind of have a game plan of what farms I want to get planted around what date. I have farms that dry out earlier versus some that dry out later. And I try to spread those planting dates out across from that very early part of April all the way to the 1st of June. But I'll game plan, I want, maybe these 2 fields planted on the first couple of days that I have available in April. And when I get those farms planted, I'll stop the planter even if it looks like I should be planting. And I'll wait till the next opportunity, I'll let the rain pass or whatever, and then I'll get started again, and that way I don't slug all my acres through into one particular time slot that you don't know if you're going to get a cold rain or what environment, you might get a heat spill during pollination. And it's been good for me. It doesn't stress me out as bad. I don't feel like I'm under the gun as much. I do want to get those ones that I have penciled in planted, but I don't have, a couple thousand acres hanging over me. I've got a couple hundred hanging over me. And
where I was almost going with that is if a guy plants 14 days, hard planting for 14 days, how many of those 14 days do you think were really, really good days? on average for the average guy?
Probably
2 or 3?
Yeah, maybe 2.
2 or 3 days.
Yeah.
And that's where I go back. I'm like, okay, if you're making a hardware decision and you're gonna put another moving part on the planner, it working and being logistically efficient has to be a part of the equation, because in all reality, you're going to get 3 days where you're like, this is the best it's planted all season. And you want to get as many acres as you can in that little window. And it's typically really small, even relative to the small window of the total planting.
Sure.
But you normally get 2 or 3 days that you feel really, really good about it.
Oh, yeah. There's always either, you're either coming out of a rainfall event or you're going into a rainfall event, and your soil conditions are always, they're either very few times will they be exactly perfect, You're probably going to be either a little too dry in the very first 2 inches, usually not in the spring, but it's a possibility, or, you're too wet.
Yeah.
Very few times will it be exactly perfect like you need it to be. Especially,
we've beat hardware to death, haven't we?
Oh, for sure.
But that's been the biggest thing that's probably the fertility aspect, the products have changed, but the hardware's changed a lot for me. That's the reason we probably spent so much time talking about it. Is I feel a lot different about what I want to put on a planter today than I did 6 years ago when I started down that road.
It's definitely an important decision you're making when you're choosing the stuff to add to the planter that is going to make you profitable or not profitable in that endeavor.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the elements while we still got some time.
And I think this probably segues pretty good, because the nutrients that I think carry the most weight and impact that we run on the planter is nitrogen and sulfur. And so because of that, dribbling on top of the ground right works pretty good. Because a lot of times you can put a stabilizer with it, you can put some humic acid with it or something, where you're probably not going to lose the nitrogen that you put on top of the ground. And in all reality, we get enough rainfall around planting season that nitrogen is going to get incorporated into the ground.
Sure. So your earth is negatively charged. Electricians use grounds, to ground electricity. Nitrogen and sulfur are also negatively charged. So they're going to flow through the soil very easily, and that's probably why you can lay it on top and it gets down to the soil profile you need it to.
So we have tested, we've tested lots of stuff and lots of products. We tried to isolate nutrients and not necessarily look as much about which products outperform the other. So we weren't that interested in taking 3 different phosphorus sources on the planter, this company's product and this company's product and this company's product, and saying, okay, now which product is better out of those 3? We really started it going, okay, NPK, sulfur, boron, what's carrying the weight on the planter, and then after that we'll figure out which product maybe makes the most sense. But we started with the actual nutrient focus first, and so we tried to isolate passes of just nitrogen, passes of nitrogen and sulfur, some passes with some straight phosphorus, and there's always arguments, well, you had to have more than just nitrogen to make that work, but we tried to isolate as much as we can to figure out what that lowest hole in the barrel was that was leaking out some yield, right? So this is going on 6 seasons. No matter what program a guy asks, no matter what his soil, it always matters what his soil samples and concentration is, but typically speaking, I'm going to make a recommendation that the foundation is in nitrogen and sulfur on the planter. And there's other people that have validated this. Somewhere around that 40 to 60 units of actual nitrogen on the planter seems to really be the sweet spot. So that is the base for everything. And I make a recommendation based off of trial work we have done. And I hate to go back again, but I've had a hard time. We've been talking about, when we say planter fertility, there's 2 ways to do that, right? We could put it on in furrow, or we could put it on in a traditional, they call it tuba 2 or tuba 0. It's more commodity-based fertilizer that we put in larger quantities to get larger amounts of nutrients, right? I have had a really hard time making in furrow pay. So I might as well just get that out there. We've been doing it 6 years now. And I'm not saying I'm not getting yield bumps from it, but for the cost of those products, because they have to be lower salt, they have to be safe to the seed, that I've had a really difficult time not getting yield responses, just getting net returns for as far as money financially. I'm not making them pay consistently.
No, I would agree with that. Like I struggled to, I could see maybe, like I could definitely see a benefit to the product that I was applying a lot of times, but I never could consistently make it pay. And I also had a lot of different trouble. Like it would plug really bad. Like I'd always having to be trying to take a rubber line off and replace it. It was something that was a super big challenge for me.
Yep.
And I strayed away from it. Not to say, hey, and there's going to be somebody that's like, hey, I've killed it with Infura. And I'm not criticizing you. I'm just saying it didn't work on this particular operation very good with what I was trying.
Yeah, and typically you have to approach it really. If a guy's asking a lot of questions, a lot of times he's a guy that's not doing anything today. And so he doesn't have any plant fertility on, right? And so when you start talking about Infura and Tuba2, to me, initially, it needs to be more of a choice because let's think back to logistics. Now, all of a sudden, we're talking about multiple tanks on the, you're going to have a tank for Infura, you're going to have a tank for your Tuba2. It gets overwhelming for a guy that's went from not doing anything to taking a step forward saying, hey, I'm going to look at some fertility on there. I will tell you my experience of guys, if there's a guy listening today that has no planter fertility on his planter at all, he's not tanks, nothing, don't start with Infura. Start with Tuba2. And our research would suggest that. Infura is easier, right? It's less gallons. It's less fill-ups. It makes more sense, and that's really where the industry went to kind of get you into it. They started with Infura, right? Because they knew you wouldn't complain about 3 gallon an acre, but you would complain about 20. So how are we going to bridge Neil into putting a tank on the planter? We're going to say, hey, just put 3 gallon Infura, But my research, and again, to your point, it may be different somewhere else, but locally in the purchase area, I've had a really hard time making Infuras profitable.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. It's just it's very difficult here to find something that works every season and that pays that produces an ROI worthy of having it on your planter.
Yeah. Now, if a guy's going to say, well, I'm a biological guy and I'm putting humic acid and stuff in I think that's a different conversation because you can't strip trial those products. That's like going no-till. Like if you're going to go down a soil health road, you can't do 6 rows in one field and expect to see an immediate change, right? That's a process. So the only caveat to saying I can't make Infuras pay locally that well is maybe a guy that's going to go down the soil health road and he's committed to humic acids and sugars and stuff like that. To me, that is something that I can't relate to in a strip trial very well because I think that is a process that takes time to see the fruits of that investment. So I think that'd be the one caveat. I think you could say what we've done is valid in a strip trial setup with phosphorus, with actual nutrients that we're trying to see a current year yield increase. But if you do go down soil health stuff in furrow, that is a process that I think is harder to quantify than looking at a 829.2 product in furrow that we look at the expense of it and it picked us up 2 bushel. Well, yeah, but it didn't even pay for itself, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I think we have learned that over the course of time that, that the guys that are doing things like humic acids and sugars and biological stuff, and that's like niche and popular right now. That stuff is not always quantified in one season. It may take some time, and that's kind of like no-till. We've gone down that road here, and lots of cover crops, and I can't say that every season that is going to make me money. It may actually cost me money each season. Probably is costing me money, but over the course of time, will I see some benefits from it? Probably, but we're even as long as we've been into it, it's hard to say exactly what it's gained us other than we know it's saving some of our soil.
It starts as a faith-based journey, right? It's not somebody did a humic acid product and I say, oh, it picks me up 5 bushel every year, Neil. It's when you make the commitment into soil health initiatives, it is, you don't quantify that typically. It is a faith-based journey that you made a conscious decision today. Like, hey, I'm going to believe this guy over here. He started doing it 20 years ago, and he thinks his soil health is exponentially better than it was 20 years ago. You're just going to trust that recommendation. The work we do, I need to quantify things more. So it's hard for me to quantify a lot of soil health benefits. Now I am starting to go down that road. So at our location in Mayfield at Patriot Ag, we actually set aside 2 different blocks that we're going to invest in long term, and we're going to treat them completely different. So maybe in 5 years, Neil, I can walk in this office, or 10 or 15 years, hopefully, and I can help quantify some of those biological soil health initiatives that are hard to quantify today. Maybe 10 years from now, when we treat those 2 blocks separately for a long period of time. One, we're doing no-till and cover crop, and we're using less synthetic fertilizer. We're going to try to ban things more and be more efficient. And then the other one, we're going to treat like we treated the last 20 years. We're going to be doing multiple tillage applications, and we're going to be spreading a lot of dry fertilizer on it, doing those things. And we'll just see where it shakes out as far as how we quantify that. So we're taking into consideration input costs, yield returns. We actually pulled some baseline Haney tests on those 2 blocks to see which one has more biological activity today, and see if we make an impact on that 10 years from now. So I may be able to quantify it, just not, you can't do it in 1 year,
Right.
in one strip.
I think it's super interesting to think about, because, like, if you're farming one style, and you're totally regen, you're like all no-till, say you just applied calcium only, and you said, well, all commercial fertilizers are acidic, and acid's going to drive your calcium in a negative way.
Yeah.
And then you're going to have to apply more fertilizer, versus you got you're all old school over here. And what I think is interesting is this year, or maybe last year, you saw the Calmer guy, who's been a no-till guy for a long period of time and done lots of replicated trials, found that he had what he called a DAP dome or whatever at the top, and turned his soil over and saw benefit from it. So, all this stuff is, we're learning over time of, what we think maybe is the best today may not be the best 10 years.
We don't have it all figured out.
We
yet,
don't.
Right?
And we probably will never have it all figured out.
No. But I want to make sure I answer your question on what nutrient, because we went through the hardware kind of journey there. But as far as the nutrients, I still say my data has suggested that obviously you build the foundation of nitrogen and sulfur. We typically put a lot of emphasis on phosphorus there. But I'll tell you, I've been amazed the crops I have seen, the 250, 275 bushel corn crops that I've seen come off of relatively low phosphorus levels. So I'm looking at potassium on I guess in the last couple of years, I'm looking at potassium on the planter a little bit harder than I was phosphorus. I think traditionally we think about, outside of nitrogen and sulfur, we think about, if you look at P and K, we typically put a little bit more focus on P, because that was what was our base in the in-furrow programs when they started, and people started putting a little bit of phosphorus in furrow and stuff. But I think in our particular area around here, we have a mobility issue with potassium. We have some compaction issues. We have low concentration to begin with. And so I'm going to spend a little bit more time. I think nitrogen and sulfur stays the base and the foundation of whatever we build on the planter. But I'm going to look a lot harder at the potassium piece on the planter as that next thing. Hey, is this going to... Nitrogen and sulfur has proved to pay for itself on the planter. We've kind of moved beyond that over the last 5 years. Like it's one of those things. It's not every year. It's not always, but it's enough times that it's paying for itself and more.
I think what we found here is definitely, like, it's best to spread your nitrogen out during the course of the season. And a great time is to start doing that is to first get it out there early when the corn needs it on the planter. and then that extends your window a little bit to get your second application. When the corn has a little bit more size to it, you're a little bit down the road. You're past a lot of times the very, very heavy rains that we're receiving here in the Purchase area, Kentucky and Western Tennessee, in the late March, early April time period. So I'd agree with that. And we've always historically underapplied sulfur with our nitrogens, and as we've kicked our sulfur up, that has definitely gained us an advantage over the top of just straight nitrogen. So talk about that a little bit. Why is sulfur beneficial to your nitrogen?
Well, it almost acts a little bit like a stabilizer too. But there's just a certain amount of requirement a corn or a bean crop has in sulfur, and I think it just gets back to what do you typically do? I mean, guys have been satisfied with 15 or 20 pounds of sulfur, and I'm finding out that's just simply not enough in times, especially when you start talking about higher yield environments. That our sulfur requirements are pretty high.
Yeah, I've noticed that like if we're not applying more pounds than we've applied over the last few seasons, or I guess when we first got into this. Like when we're tissue sampling these plants, you're seeing a deficiency in sulfur, so I agree. I think that's one of the things that, you need to look at really hard if you haven't been doing any of this stuff, getting that sulfur out there with your nitrogen in the right ratio. And that way, as if you have the potential, you're getting the right rainfall or the right conditions, that your corn can move up into the mid 200 bushel level, and that's when it really becomes necessary to have enough sulfur. It's always, you always need sulfur, but as the yield level moves up into the mid and high 200s, the demand just ramps up really high.
Yep. I would probably rank for somebody again I want to simplify it as far as what we've seen. I would probably rank 4 nutrients on the planter, and I would rank them in this order, right? So number 1 would probably be nitrogen, that 40 to 60 units. Number 2 would be sulfur, if I'm prioritizing things. Number 3 would be potassium on the planter, and I'll tell you why I put that in front of boron as the 4th. I would put nitrogen, sulfur, potassium, boron in that order on the planter we've seen the best results with. I did put potassium in front of boron because I think boron can be very responsive in a foliar application. There's just a lot of ways we could put boron on and make a huge impact. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the planter, right? You may make a foliar fungicide application and you can move the boron needle enough for you personally by just doing a foliar boron, right? Where potassium, I think you get to the place that you really need that big uptake of potassium, somewhere around V5 to, V11, V12 or tassel. And so to me, the best time to put that on outside of dry applications, maybe in the fall, would be on the planter. We did a big tissue sample initiative this past year at Patriot, and they've been doing it across the lakes for several years, but we started this year. We had about 25 growers in that program, and it did validate that I still say potassium's a big problem for us in a corn crop. Our concentrations are already low, but I still say it's not as much about concentration as mobility. We have a lot of compaction issues, and I just think a lot of this corn crop is not accessing the amount of potassium it needs to because of the mobility issues with that nutrient. And so if you're going to address that, everybody wants to just say, well, put on a bunch more potassium and increase your concentration in the soil, right? And I think the low-hanging fruit there is we need to look at some compaction issues first, because that's the easiest thing to fix, and then lower populations in corn a little bit if we know we've got a problem. Because anytime if you go out and you say, I want to plant this hybrid at 40,000 and we've got a potassium problem, that's going to really exacerbate our challenges out there. So that's the reason I put potassium as number 3, is because we're seeing benefits from our trial work, but I'm also seeing you start doing 2,500 tissue samples across an area, you start figuring out pretty quick where we've got issues. And potassium is something I think we've got to really look at. And that's not necessarily saying, hey, you need to go apply 400 pounds of potash this fall. I think we got to look at some other stuff. I'm not saying we don't need to apply potassium, because we do, but there's some other issues out there that we're dealing with around compaction and some other things that would fix it quicker.
Yeah. What I've found, I guess one of the biggest challenges of this farm is low potassium levels. Our soils are historically high in calcium, low in magnesium, and our base sats on the calcium are on potassium's 2.5 to 3. 3 would be the high range you'd see on any of these
Absolutely.
farms. And when you get into drought situations with a corn crop and dryland corn crop, and you're short potassium, you begin to see those tops fall out, and all the problems associated with it. Yield drag at the very end when you need potassium uptake. The most. It's just not available.
That's right.
So it's a huge challenge here in the Purchase region.
I think that's our number one. Nitrogen's easy. I mean, for the most part, nitrogen and sulfur is easy to make adjustments on. The potassium thing, I think, is the one issue we're facing that we've got to wrangle a little bit. And I think everybody wants to go straight to put on more potassium. But you've seen the tillage applications that happen around here the beginning of April. So we have a compaction problem on the majority of the farms I get on. And we've talked about this before. If you go, maybe not to you personally, but as a crop consultant or an agronomist or whatever title somebody wants to give me, when you tell somebody they have a compaction problem, you might as well slap their mama.
Yeah, people don't want to hear that,
People do not want to hear that. And I guess I need to figure out a way to better communicate that's not threatening. But we've recognized through tissue sample programs and soil sampling that potassium is a problem in the Purchase area of Kentucky. And I think one of the bigger drivers to that is our compaction problems. So to me, instead of going, I think some guys would rather you recommend 300 pounds of potash in the fall than say, hey, I think a well-timed tillage application out here to get rid of a hardman would make you more money. I think some people would rather you say put on more potassium, but that's just something I've noticed, that if there's a guy listening that has low base saturations of K and he's struggling with it in tissue samples, that before you take a recommendation that says put on copious amounts of potash in the fall, go out and do a little homework for yourself and take a pentrometer out to some of these fields and see if you have a problem that is creating more of a mobility issue than it is a concentration issue in the soil.
What I've seen is, with trying to boost my potassium levels, when I first got into really looking hard in fertility, I was like, well, that's easy fix. I'll just go out and spread a bunch of potassium. But what I found is it actually affected me negatively. Mm-hmm. So you just can't go out and just expect to go spread 300 to 500 pounds of 0060 and it's going to fix your problem overnight or even 3 years. You may have bigger problems once you've done that than you had before. And that's what I found. Like that option is not an option. It may work somewhere. Here in the Purchase area of Kentucky, you can't just go spread copious amounts of potassium and then your base saturation problem's fixed.
We've been down that road of spreading some hot streaks, right, in some fields that are low and seeing if those show up, and typically they don't.
Yeah, they don't.
Because there's something else. I'm not saying we don't need more potash concentration.
Sure.
But there's something else, because we've done the hot streak thing.
Yeah.
And we're not seeing big responses from it.
The farm right across the street, which is my dad's favorite farm, is historically produced, one of the best of all our fields in our lineup. And I screwed it up by spreading potash on it in too large of amounts at a time. And it's taken time to get its yield back.
Yeah.
And, if you don't think that's like the one your dad likes to look at the best, if you don't think that's a that thing will kick you you know.
That is in
that
front of
table.
his house.
I
Right?
mean, it is. He has to look. He has to get up every morning and look at it. And there's there's a valley right there at the base of his yard that has been, one of the highest producing areas of the field, and it's had a yellow spot in it for a couple of seasons because of the toxicity of the potassium out there. So you can cause more problems by trying to fix problems. And Jesse and I talk about this a lot. And this is with life. And you probably know what I'm going to say, with life or with anything, balance in all this stuff is key.
Agree.
When you try to change one individual element, it throws everything else out of whack. So you need to approach this fertility thing in a balanced way and understand that all these things need to be in correct ratios, and the right application at the right timing and the right amounts.
That's right.
is what makes you effective in the fertility game, and not just chasing one certain element. Like they do have ranking orders, but you also have to take a balanced approach in the right ratios.
That's right.
And the right form too.
Agree.
So we're going to pause this here and come back next week with Jesse again. A pretty interesting conversation. If you enjoyed it, like, share, and subscribe.